Welcome to the Buried Ledger. Before we begin this story, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button right now, and in the comments, tell me where you're watching this from. Before we begin, I need you to understand something about distance. 1,500 yards is not a number. It is a specific physical reality that most people who have never fired a rifle cannot properly imagine. It is 8.5 football fields laid end to end. It is the length of 14 city blocks. It is a distance at which the human eye, without magnification, cannot distinguish a man's face from his body. At which the target is a shape, not a person. At which the wind, the humidity, the temperature, the angle of the sun, the exact moment in the breathing cycle when the trigger is pulled, all of it matters. All of it changes the outcome, and all of it must be accounted for by a mind that has been building this calculation for years. In the summer of 1856, in Noxubee County, Mississippi, a woman named Grace stood at the edge of a tree line, 8.5 football fields from the main house of the Callaway plantation. She had a rifle that she had obtained through methods nobody asked about. She had been still for 40 minutes, which was not unusual for her, because Grace had been being still in situations that required stillness her entire life. She waited for the window to open. The window opened. She fired once. James Callaway, 26 years old, son of the plantation's owner, fell backward from the window of his study with a single wound that the county physician could not adequately explain in terms of trajectory given the apparent direction of the shot. He spent 3 days searching the surrounding area for a firing position. He found signs of a person in the tree line 8.5 football fields away and dismissed them as irrelevant because no one, he wrote in his report, could have made that shot. He was wrong. Grace had been making shots like that since she was 9 years old. They sent 5 men to find her. None of them came back. She was free by September. She was back for her daughter by October. This is her story. Welcome to Lens of History. Hit that like button and let's go back to 1856. Mississippi, Noxubee County, 1848. Grace was 8 years old when Old Master Fenwick decided she had good eyes. He said it the way men said things about the people they owned, not to her, not as if she were present, but to the man he was speaking with, a neighboring planter named Aldridge, while Grace stood 6 feet away, holding a basket of laundry and waiting for permission to move. "That girl has the eyes of a hawk," Fenwick said. He was 62, white-haired, with a specific comfortable largeness of a man who had never in his life gone without a meal. He was pointing at Grace without looking at her, the way you pointed a feature of the landscape. "Watched her spot a rabbit in the tall grass at 200 yards yesterday. Didn't blink, just stood there and watched it move." Aldridge looked at Grace. "How old? 8, 9, maybe? We're not entirely sure." Aldridge nodded with the nod of a man filing away a piece of information. Then he said, "You know what I do with an eye like that?" Fenwick said, "What?" Aldridge said, "I teach it to shoot." Grace stood with her laundry basket and heard this conversation and filed it in the place inside herself that things mattered. She did not look at the 2 men. She looked at the tree line at the edge of the Fenwick property, 200 yards away, where a large oak had lost a branch in last winter's ice storm, and where, at the junction of the remaining branch and the trunk, a red-tailed hawk was sitting so still it could have been part of the tree. She had been watching it for 10 minutes. Neither man had noticed it. She thought, "I see things they don't see." She thought, "I don't know yet what that means." She would find out. Aldridge borrowed her for the following summer on a handshake arrangement between neighboring planters, the casual commerce of people who treated other people as resources to be allocated and shared according to mutual convenience. He took her to his plantation in the northern part of the county, where he kept a shooting range on the back 40 acres that he used for his own recreation and for the specific entertainment of teaching people to shoot. Not enslaved people usually, but Aldridge was a man who found conventional behavior limiting. He was 44 years old, had made his money in cotton and kept some of it in whiskey and poker, and had a quality of erratic enthusiast that made him unpredictable in the specific way of men who have enough wealth to pursue whatever captures their attention without considering if it makes sense. Grace had captured his attention. He put a rifle in her hands on the first day and watched her hold it, watched the way she assessed its weight, found the balance point without being shown, raised it to her shoulder with a specific adjustment of someone who is feeling for the right angle rather than copying a taught position. "You've never held a rifle," he said. "No, sir." "How do you know where to put it?" Grace thought about this. She said, "It has a place it wants to be. You can feel it." Aldridge looked at Grace for a long moment. Then he said, "Shoot at that post." The post was 30 yards away, a wooden stake driven into the ground with a white cloth tied at the top. Grace raised the rifle. She breathed. She waited for some interior signal she couldn't have named, a settling, a readiness, the specific moment when the body stops its background motion and everything becomes still. She pulled the trigger. The cloth jumped, not the wood beneath it. She had hit the cloth, not the wood beneath it. Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then, again. She shot 7 more times that morning, 7 hits out of 7 attempts at distances he progressively increased, finishing at 150 yards. He spent the rest of that summer teaching her everything he knew. He taught her about wind, how to read it from the movement of grass and leaves, how to calculate its speed in rough terms from the degree of bending it produced in a standing stalk of corn, how it affected a bullet at different distances in ways that required not just knowledge but intuition, the accumulated feel of a person who has sent enough rounds down range to know in their body what the wind is doing. He taught her about elevation, the way a bullet dropped over distance more than people expected, the way a shot at 500 yards required a different aim point than a shot at 100, the calculation becoming more complex at every additional 100 yards, the margin for error shrinking as the distance grew. He taught her patience, not the philosophical kind, the practical kind, how to be still in a position for an hour without the body's restlessness compromising the hold, how to wait for the right moment rather than the available moment, how to let the shot come to you instead of going to the shot. Grace was 9 years old. She absorbed everything. There was one afternoon in the middle of that summer that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. They had been shooting all morning, working through distances, 200 yards, 250, 300. Aldridge had stopped talking during the shooting itself, watching without commentary, which she had learned meant he was watching seriously. At 300 yards, he set up a tin can, 6 inches in diameter, on a post. "Hit it," he said. Grace looked at the can. She looked at the wind. The grass between her and the target was nearly still, but at the tops of the trees 200 yards behind the target there was movement. Wind from the northwest, light maybe 4 miles per hour. She calculated the effect at 300 yards. She adjusted her aim point left by the amount the calculation produced. She fired. The can jumped off the post. Aldridge was quiet. Then, "How did you know to adjust left?" "The trees behind the target." "You saw wind in trees at 200 yards behind the target?" "Yes, sir." "And you calculated the effect on the bullet?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before.
Not the enthusiasm of a man playing with an interesting toy, but something more serious, something that was almost respect, and that he clearly didn't know what to do with. "I didn't teach you that," he said. "You taught me to read the wind," Grace said. "I just read further." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, as if to himself, "God help whoever you eventually decide needs to be on the other end of a rifle." He said it as an observation about the natural world, as if her ability were a weather event, notable, perhaps alarming, but not something that required any action on his part. He set up another target. Grace shot it. She thought about what he had said for years afterward. "God help whoever you eventually decide needs to be on the other end of a rifle." She had not decided anyone at 9 years old. She had thought only about the learning itself, the specific pleasure of a skill being built and refined, each session adding something to what the previous session had established. The decision came much later. When it came, she was ready. By the end of that summer, she was shooting accurately at 400 yards. Aldridge shook his head at this, the way men shake their heads at things that contradict their expectations. He told Fenwick when he returned her in September, "That girl could put a round through a coin at 300 yards. I don't know what to do with that information." Fenwick said, "Neither do I." Neither of them did anything with it. The summer ended. Grace went back to Fenwick's plantation and went back to her regular work, the laundry, the field work, the ordinary labor of a child on a Mississippi cotton plantation. And the rifle stayed at Aldridge's property and was never offered to her again. But the knowledge didn't stay at Aldridge's property. The knowledge came back with her. And Grace spent the next 7 years adding to it, not with a rifle, which she had no access to, but with observation, with the patient, accumulated attention of a person who has been given one piece of an understanding and spends years building the rest of it from whatever is available. She watched wind every day of her life with new eyes. She calculated distances constantly, testing her estimates against known measurements, calibrating her eye against reality, until the estimates became accurate and then automatic. She maintained the physical disciplines Aldridge had taught her, the breathing, the stillness, the specific mental focus that slowed the heart rate, not because she planned to shoot anything in particular, but because these disciplines were part of her now, had become part of how she inhabited her own body. And the body doesn't easily give back what it has learned. She was 16 years old when Fenwick died, and she was sold to the Callaway plantation in the southern part of Noxubee County. She was 22 when she met a man named Samuel. Samuel was a field hand on the Callaway plantation, 30 years old, with the specific physical quality of a man who had been doing sustained outdoor work his entire adult life. Broad through the shoulders, with large, careful hands, and a quality of movement that was simultaneously efficient and unhurried. He had a quality that Grace recognized immediately, because she had it herself. He watched things, not dramatically, not with the obvious attentiveness that drew attention, with the background watchfulness of a person who has learned that the difference between manageable and unmanageable situations is usually information, and that information is everywhere if you are paying attention. They met at the water trough on a July morning, both of them there at the same time, both of them noting the other with the quick peripheral assessment of people who have learned to evaluate situations fast. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither of them said anything. 3 days later, he was working the field adjacent to hers, and he said, without looking at her, in the specific conversational register that allowed communication while appearing to be talking to no one, "Did you see that hawk?" Grace looked at the sky without visibly looking at the sky, a specific skill, the ability to direct your gaze without directing your face. There was a hawk circling at high altitude above the eastern field, barely visible, a dark speck against the blue, red-tailed, she said, hunting the east fence line. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How can you tell from here what kind it is?" "The way it moves," she said, "the way it holds its wings." He looked at her then, a real look, the kind that assessed rather than admired. "I'm Samuel," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm Grace." "I know," he said. They worked in adjacent fields for the rest of that summer, and the communication that developed between them was the compressed, efficient communication of two people who had both learned that words were valuable and scarce and should carry maximum information per syllable. They learned each other in fragments, his history, her history, the specific knowledge each had accumulated about the Callaway plantation and its operations, the people on it, the patterns of authority and enforcement that organized daily life. He learned about the shooting, not immediately.
She told him after 3 months, on an October evening in the quarters, when it had become clear to both of them that they were telling each other things they hadn't told anyone else. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "How far?" he asked. "At the end of that summer, 400 yards consistently." "What does that mean?" "It means at 400 yards I could put a round in a space the size of a man's chest 9 times out of 10. He was quiet again. Then, "Could you go further than 400 yards?" "Yes," she said, "if I had the rifle and the time and the conditions. The knowledge doesn't stop at 400. The knowledge goes as far as the bullet goes." Samuel looked at her in the way he had looked at her the first time, the assessment look, the look of a man calibrating something. Then he said, "I hope you never need it." "So do I," Grace said. She meant it then. She would mean it differently later. James Callaway was 23 years old when Grace arrived at the Callaway plantation, and he was the specific kind of man that specific circumstances produced. Raised in wealth and authority, accustomed to having everything he wanted, possessed of a quality of confidence that had never been tested by its absence, and therefore had no sense of its limits. He was not the worst of his kind. He could be charming, even kind, in the specific way of people for whom kindness costs nothing and requires no sacrifice. He was educated, had spent 2 years at a college in Virginia before his father's health required his return, and had a quality of intelligence that, directed at the right objects, might have made him something worth knowing. Directed at Grace, it made him dangerous. He first noticed her in the spring of 1854, on a morning when she was carrying water from the well to the main house kitchen. He was on the veranda with a cup of coffee, watching the morning, and she crossed his line of sight, and he stopped watching the morning. He was 26, she was 25. They had been married to Samuel for 2 years. Their daughter, a girl they called Lily, was 11 months old. Grace felt his attention the way people with her quality of awareness feel things, not through any dramatic signal, not through anything that could be pointed to as evidence, but through the accumulated small data of the way certain silences changed when she entered a space, the way certain eyes moved in certain ways, the way the ordinary management of proximity shifted around a specific person. She had been managing this quality of attention from men since she was 16. She knew its varieties, the casual, the predatory, the calculated. She knew what each kind led to and what it required to navigate. She managed it. She was careful. She made herself useful, reliable, invisible in the specific way that men decided the pursuit was more effort than it was worth. James Callaway was not dissuaded by effort. He approached her directly in May of 1854 in the kitchen garden where she was working late in the afternoon. He came around the corner of the kitchen building and stopped as if surprised to find her there, which was a performance. He knew she was there, had been watching the garden for 10 minutes from the upper floor window of the main house. "Grace," he said, "Mr. Callaway." She did not stop working. She did not look at him. "I'd like to talk to you." "I'm working, sir." "I know you are." He paused. He was not accustomed to pausing in these situations, not accustomed to the small resistance of a woman who continued what she was doing rather than giving him her full attention. "I'd like you to stop working for a moment." Grace stopped.
She turned. She looked at him with an expression she had been practicing since she was 16, not inviting, not hostile, simply neutral, the face of a person waiting for information. He talked. She listened. He said things that men in his position said in these situations, things that dressed a specific intention in the language of admiration, of distinction, of being set apart from the ordinary. She heard every word and understood every word's actual meaning. When he finished, she said, "I'm married, Mr. Calloway." He looked at her as if this was an interesting piece of information rather than a relevant fact. "I know," he said. "Samuel is my husband. I know who Samuel is." She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not communication exactly, but was mutual understanding. She understood what he was saying. He understood that she understood. And she understood that her understanding made no difference to what he intended. She said, "I'd like to get back to work, sir." He let her get back to work. He came back the following week, and the week after that.
And each time she gave him the same answer in different words, the same refusal, the same reference to her marriage, the same request to be allowed to continue working. Each time he left, each time he came back. Samuel knew. She told him everything because they had built their marriage on the specific foundation of complete information. Two people who shared what they knew, because what they knew was the only resource they had, and sharing it was the only way to make it sufficient. Samuel listened. His face did the thing her face did in difficult moments, showed nothing, absorbed everything. When she finished, he said, "What do you need?" "Time," she said. "I think you'll stop." Samuel looked at her. "Do you believe that?" She was quiet for a moment. "No." "Neither do I," he said. They held each other in the dark of the quarters, and they did not say what they were both thinking, because some things, once said, could not be unsaid, and some calculations, once completed, changed everything. They did not sleep much that night. Samuel died on a Tuesday morning in August of 1855. The official account, written in the Calloway Plantation Ledger by Old Master Calloway himself, read, "Samuel, field hand, deceased August 14th, 1855. Accident, fell from equipment during harvest operation." There was no equipment involved in what happened to Samuel on August 14th, 1855. Grace was not there when it happened. She was in the main house kitchen, which was where James Calloway had arranged for her to be reassigned 2 weeks earlier. A quiet administrative decision that she had understood immediately and had no power to reverse. She was in the kitchen when the news came, carried by a woman named Dora who worked the field, and whose face, when she came through the kitchen door, told Grace everything before she said a word. Grace set down what she was holding. She looked at Dora's face. She said, "Where?" Dora told her where. Grace walked out of the kitchen. She walked across the yard. She walked to the edge of the east field, where Samuel was lying in the dirt between 2 rows of cotton, and she knelt beside him, and she put her hand on his face, and she stayed that way for a long time. Around her, the field had gone silent. The other workers had stopped and formed a loose perimeter of grief and witness. The specific formation that enslaved people made around death, because they had no other ceremony, no other way to mark the boundary between a person existing and a person not existing, except to stop what they were doing and stand close. Grace knelt in the dirt, and she put her hand on Samuel's face, and she said his name once. Then she stood up.
She picked up Lily, who was 14 months old and had been carried to the field by the woman who watched the babies during work hours, and who did not understand what was happening, but who felt the quality of her mother's arms and went still. Grace held her daughter, and she looked at the main house, visible from the east field, the white walls of the Calloway house, pale in the August heat, the upper windows bright with reflected sun. One of those windows was James Calloway's study. Grace looked at it. She did not cry. She had been trained out of public grief by the same world that had trained her out of public fear and public anger. The same comprehensive training that produced the neutral face, the managed response, the body that absorbed what was done to it without transmitting it visibly to the people watching. She held Lily, and she looked at the window, and something that had been held in tension inside her for a very long time became still. Not resolved, not released, still. The way a rifle is still at the moment of aim. She began to plan what happened next. James Calloway did not understand consequence, he understood it as opportunity. Samuel's death removed the one obstacle he had acknowledged. He told himself, in whatever language men tell themselves these things, that what he wanted from Grace, the consent, was a category that didn't apply in the specific relationship that existed between him and every person on his father's plantation. He had not thought about it that way when Samuel was alive, had managed the performance of patience and pursuit, had accepted her refusals as temporary complications. Now the complication was gone. He came to the quarters 3 weeks after Samuel's death. He was not subtle about it. He had reached the point at which he no longer found subtlety useful. What happened in the quarters that night is the part of this story that history most often loses, not the fact, which was documented, which left evidence that the plantation's records contain, if you know how to read them, but the specific experience of it, the specific quality of what it is to have something happen to you that you could not prevent and did not consent to, and that the world around you has decided doesn't count as the thing it is. Grace survived it the way she survived everything, by going somewhere inside herself where the outside could not fully reach, by maintaining in the deepest part of her the knowledge that what was happening was not the total of the person, that the person being acted upon was not the total of the person, that there was something in her that this could not touch. She held this knowledge. It was the hardest thing she had ever held. She lay in the dark of the quarters, and she breathed in, out. The breathing discipline Aldridge had taught her, the specific slowing of breath that slowed everything else, that brought the heart rate down, that produced the stillness from which accuracy came. She had not thought when she learned this breathing that she would ever need it for this, for the specific task of remaining inside her own body when her body had been treated as something that belonged to someone else, for the maintenance of selfhood under conditions designed to unmake it. She breathed. She thought about Samuel, about the specific weight when he held her, the specific quality of being held by someone who had chosen to hold you, who held you because they wanted to, and because you wanted them to, and because the mutual wanting was the whole of it. She thought about his hands, which were the hands of a field worker, and were large and careful, and had never once touched her in a way she hadn't wanted. She thought about him specifically as she could, every detail she could find and hold. His voice, the way he laughed, which was rare and therefore valuable. The specific expression he had worn on the morning of the day she told him about the shooting, the long quiet, and then the single question, how far? She thought, they took you. They cannot take what I know. They cannot take what I feel when I think of you. They cannot take what is inside me. She thought about what was going to happen next, not with emotion, with a cold, patient, precise attention that had been her most essential quality since she was 8 years old, watching a hawk from 200 yards while two men discussed her without seeing her. She was going to need a rifle. She was going to need time. She was going to need everything she knew and everything she had been building since the summer at Aldridge's plantation. And she was going to need the kind of patience that understood the difference between the available moment and the right moment. She had all of these things. She breathed in. She breathed out. She began to plan. She held Lily afterward. The baby was asleep. Grace held her and looked at the ceiling of the quarters in the dark.
And she thought about Samuel, about his voice, about the way he had said, "I hope you never need it." She thought, "I need it." She thought, "I'm going to need everything I know." She began to plan in earnest. A rifle on a Mississippi plantation in 1856 was not impossible to obtain. It was not easy. It was not safe. It required the specific combination of patience, network, and opportunity that characterized every significant act of agency available to enslaved people. Not dramatic, not fast, not the kind of thing that happened in a moment of inspiration. The kind of thing that happened over months through the underground of information and connection that Grace had been part of since arriving at the Callaway plantation. She knew a man named Ezra who worked the Callaway stables and who had connections to a free black family in the town of Macon, 15 miles east. She knew the Free family had connections she didn't know the full extent of. She knew that knowledge of what she needed had to be passed carefully in fragments through intermediaries who knew only their piece of the chain. She spent 4 months building the chain. The rifle arrived in December of 1855, wrapped in oilcloth inside a barrel of legitimate goods delivered to the plantation storage. It was a Sharps percussion rifle, 1852 model, a weapon with a reputation for accuracy at distance that was not accidental. It had been designed specifically for long-range precision, with a barrel and action that rewarded the kind of shooter who understood what they were doing. Grace understood what she was doing. She kept the rifle in a hiding place she had identified 3 months before the rifle arrived. A specific hollow in a specific tree in the woodlot at the eastern edge of the plantation's territory, accessible from her regular route to the water source. Retrievable in a way that produced no visible deviation from her ordinary pattern of movement. She had identified this location the same way she identified everything else, by watching over months the patterns of surveillance and movement on the plantation, finding the gaps, understanding the blind spots. She practiced in the hours before dawn twice a week in the deep woods east of the woodlot, where the sound would be absorbed by the timber and the darkness would prevent observation. Not extensive practice. She could not afford extensive practice in terms of ammunition, which was as difficult to obtain as the rifle. Enough practice to confirm that the knowledge was still in her body, that the 7 years of observation and discipline had maintained what the summer at Aldridge's plantation had built. The knowledge was still there. It had been waiting. She spent the winter doing 2 things simultaneously, practicing and watching the main house. She watched James Callaway's habits with the same systematic attention she had given wind and elevation at 9 years old, not as hatred, not as obsession, but as data collection. What time he rose, what time he entered his study, how he moved through the day, which window he habitually occupied at which hour, the specific geography of his routine. She was building a shot. Not a moment of rage,
A calculation. The same cold, patient, precise calculation that Aldridge had taught her was the foundation of accuracy at distance. The understanding that a long shot is not an act, but a product, the accumulation of everything you know arriving at a single point at the right moment. She found the point in April. There was a window in James Calloway's study that faced east. He opened it every morning between 8 and 8:30 to read his correspondence, sitting at his desk with the window behind him, the light coming in over his left shoulder. He did this every day with the consistency of a man who has rituals and has never had reason to question them. The tree line to the east was 850 yards from that window. Not 1,500 yards, not yet. She had chosen a position further back, 1,500 yards, not because 850 was insufficient. A shot at 850 yards was within her demonstrated capability, extended but manageable. She chose 1,500 yards for the same reason a careful person chooses more certainty rather than less. At 1,500 yards, working back from the shooting position, the realistic search radius for an investigator was enormous. At 850 yards, the tree line was the obvious first search area. She needed to be past the obvious. She needed the shot to seem impossible. It would not be impossible. It would be very hard, at the outer edge of what she believed she could do, requiring conditions she could not fully control and a level of execution that left no margin for error. But it was not impossible. She had been building to this moment for 7 years without knowing she was building to it. The wind reading, the elevation calculation, the breathing discipline, the patience, all of it had been accumulating the way the cave white accumulated, one layer at a time, until the accumulation was sufficient. She spent March and April making the shot in her mind. Every morning she ran the calculation. Wind from the south at approximately 8 miles per hour, typical for this time of year in this part of Mississippi. Temperature cool for the season, consistent with her calculations. The sky was clear, which mattered for light and visibility, but which also meant no weather uncertainty. Grace walked her normal morning route. She collected water at the source. She deviated on the return by a path she had used twice before, a route that looked like a slightly longer version of the normal route, if anyone was watching, which at this hour no one was. She retrieved the rifle from the hollow tree. She continued east into the woodlot, then past it into the open
ground beyond, moving through tall grass that was chest-high in places that concealed a person moving carefully. She reached her position at 7:48. She lay down. She had been in this position 3 times before, twice to confirm the sight lines, once to run the full calculation with the rifle actually in hand without shooting. She knew the ground under her, knew the specific height of the grass, how it moved in the south wind, how to read its movement from her prone position for real-time wind data. She laid the rifle across the grass, supported on her left forearm, and she looked at the main house of the Calloway plantation from 1,500 yards. The window was closed. She waited. At 8:11, the window opened. She saw the movement. At this distance, the window was a small rectangle of dark in the pale wall of the house. She could see that it had opened, could see the change in the geometry of light at that point in the building, could not see what was happening inside. She did not need to see what was happening inside. She knew what was happening inside. She brought the rifle up. She breathed. She thought about Samuel, about his voice in the dark of the quarters the last night, saying the thing that needed to be said, even though saying it was difficult. "I hope you never need it." She thought about Lily asleep in the quarters, 11 months old now, who did not know that this morning was different from other mornings. She thought, this is the last morning that things are the way they have been.
She exhaled. She waited for the stillness. It came. She pulled the trigger. The rifle fired. The recoil moved through her body and was absorbed. She did not break her position. She kept her eye on the window. For a moment, nothing visible happened. At 1,500 yards, the bullet was in flight for slightly over 2 seconds. 2 seconds in which the morning continued. Birds calling in the woodlot behind her. The wind moving through the grass. The ordinary sounds of a plantation coming awake. Then the shape in the window changed. She could not see details at this distance. She did not need to. The change in the shape of the window was sufficient information. She had made the shot. She was already moving. She did not run. Running was the signature of someone who had done something and was fleeing from it. She moved at the pace of a person with a destination and a reason to be moving toward it, deliberate, purposeful, covering ground efficiently without the giveaway pattern of panic. She had prepared the next 2 hours as carefully as she had prepared the shot. The rifle went back to the hollow tree. She could not carry it, could not be found with it, and it might be needed again. She returned to her normal morning route, arriving at the quarters at what appeared to be a normal time, with the water she had collected, doing what she was supposed to be doing. What happened at the main house she heard through the network, the way everything significant always traveled on the Callaway plantation, in fragments, through the channels of communication that moved faster than any official announcement. By mid-morning she knew what the fragments said. James Callaway had been shot through the study window. He had been carried to his bedroom. The physician had been sent for. By early afternoon she knew he was dead. Old Master Callaway was in a state that paralyzed the plantation's normal operations for the rest of that day and into the next, a grief that expressed itself as immobility, the specific collapse of a man who has lost the thing he expected to outlive him. The plantation ran itself for 24 hours, which was to say that the 37 enslaved people on it ran it without supervision, which was to say they ran it the way they always ran it, but without performing the performance of supervision. In those 24 hours, Grace made arrangements. She could not take Lily yet. Lily was 14 months old and could not run and could not be carried quietly through the terrain Grace was going to have to cover. She left Lily with a woman named Ruth, who had been on this plantation for 30 years and who loved Lily with a specific ferocity of the person who had lost her own children to sale and was determined not to lose this one. She told her Ruth, "I'm coming back for her. 1 month, maybe 6 weeks. Keep her safe." Ruth looked at her. Ruth had been on this plantation for 30 years. She understood things that didn't need to be explained. "Go," Ruth said. Grace went.
They sent 5 men after her 3 days later when the investigation had established enough to know that the shot had come from the east and that the person they were looking for was Grace. The investigation had not been able to establish how. The physician who examined the trajectory had concluded correctly that the shot had come from outside the plantation grounds at a distance he could not determine but suggested was significant. He had suggested, incorrectly, that it might have been a random shot from a passing traveler or a neighboring property dispute carried too far. The investigator hired by old Callaway, a former sheriff's deputy from Macon named Whitfield, competent, experienced, with 15 years of working the county, had gone to the tree line at 850 yards and found nothing because there was nothing to find there. He had then methodically extended his search radius. He had found the position at 1,500 yards on the 4th day. The depression in the grass, the specific disturbance of a prone body in that location, the single expelled cartridge case that Grace had taken with her, but that had left a small impression in the dirt. He had looked at this evidence for a long time. Then he had looked at the distance between this position and the window.
He had gone back to old Calloway and told him that whoever had made this shot was the most capable marksperson he had ever encountered evidence of, and that this person was almost certainly no longer in the county, and that finding them would require more resources than he was prepared to recommend. Old Calloway was not interested in this recommendation. He wanted the 5 men sent. He sent them. Grace had known they would come. She had planned for them. She'd been moving northeast through Noxubee County for 3 days before they started, which gave her a head start that was more significant than it sounds. A person who knows the terrain and knows they are being followed moves very differently from 5 men who know the general direction but not the specific path. She had been watching this terrain for months in the way she watched everything, had identified the specific geography of the next 100 miles in her mind from the conversations of people who had traveled it, from the fragments of map she had seen in the main house. She had planned 3 things. The first was her route, northeast toward the hill country of Alabama, where the terrain became complex enough for organized pursuit difficult. The second was her pace, not running, because running burned energy that needed to be preserved, but sustained, the ground-covering walk of a person in good physical condition who has been doing physical work her entire life and who can maintain a specific pace for 12 hours if necessary. The third was what she would do if the 5 men got close enough to matter. She still had the rifle. She had retrieved it from the hollow tree on her way out. She had carried it for 3 days, which was not comfortable, but discomfort had never been a reason Grace stopped doing something that needed doing. The 5 men were experienced. Whitfield had chosen them specifically. Men who knew to track, who knew the terrain, who were not easily discouraged. They moved fast. They picked up her trail on the 2nd day, which was faster than she had hoped, but not faster than she had planned. She heard them before she saw them. She had been listening for them. She found her position in the hill country of western Alabama on the 3rd day of the pursuit, on a ridge that gave her a sight line of 400 yards back down the trail she had been following. Not the maximum range, not the demonstration shot, the range of certainty of the shot she knew she could make in conditions that were not ideal. Tired, having been moving for 3 days, with limited time to prepare. The first man came into sight at 400 yards at noon on the 3rd day. She waited until all 5 were visible. She made 4 shots in approximately 90 seconds. The 5th man, the one who had been furthest back in the column, the one who had seen what happened to the 4 in front of him, turned and ran. She let him run. She had what she needed, time. The 5th man running meant a delay of hours, possibly more, before anyone organized another pursuit. Hours were enough. She moved northeast. She crossed into Alabama. She kept moving. But the historical record, such as it is, assembled from plantation records and county investigation reports, and the fragmentary oral history that survived in the specific form that enslaved people's history survived, what it shows of Grace's subsequent months is this: Lily, infant, female, escaped, October, believed taken by person unknown. Person unknown. Grace came back for her daughter in late October, 6 weeks after leaving. She came the way she had planned everything, not in dramatics, not in a rush, with the patience and precision of a person who had spent a lifetime building the specific skills that the moment required. She came at night. She came alone. She knew the plantation the way you know a place you have watched for years. She knew where Ruth kept Lily. She knew the patrol patterns of what remained of the plantation's oversight, reduced now, old Calloway's estate in the process of being settled, the normal structure of authority that had organized the place for decades in the process of dissolution. She moved through the quarters in the dark. Ruth was awake, had been awake, Grace suspected, for weeks in the specific vigilance of someone who is waiting for something they have been told is coming. Grace came through the door. Ruth put Lily in her arms without a word. Grace held Lily for 1 minute. Then she wrapped her daughter in the cloth she had brought, the specific wrapping she had practiced, designed to keep a 14-year-old secure and silent in the dark. And she walked out of the quarters and across the yard and through the gap in the fence line she had identified 3 years ago and maintained quietly, specifically for this purpose. She walked northeast. Lily did not cry. She looked over her mother's shoulder at the disappearing lights of the Callaway plantation, and she looked at them with her father's eyes, careful, patient, storing everything. They walked until dawn. Grace and Lily arrived in Cincinnati in the spring of 1857. Through the network that moved people north in pieces, carried from station to station by people who had been doing this work quietly for years, without records that could be used against them. They arrived with nothing except what they carried. Grace found work.
She had specific skills, not the shooting, which had no immediate commercial application, but the observation, the patience, the capacity for sustained, careful attention that the shooting had been the expression of. She found work in a household that needed someone reliable and found her to be exactly that. Reliable, quiet, competent, never requiring more supervision than the work itself provided. She kept the shooting to herself for 3 years, until a conversation at a church meeting in 1860 with a man who was organizing what he carefully did not call a resistance network, who was looking for people with specific capabilities, who described what he was looking for in general terms that were specific enough for Grace to understand exactly what he meant. She said, "I can shoot." He looked at her. "How well?" "Well enough," she said. He asked her to demonstrate. She demonstrated. He did not ask any more questions about how well. What Grace did with that scale in the years that followed, in the specific period between 1860 and 1865, when the country was in the process of a violent renegotiation of the terms under which certain people were allowed to exist, is not fully documented, because the things she was involved in were not the kind of things that produced documentation. What is documented, in fragments, in the specific fragmentary way that certain kinds of history survives, is that she was present, that she was effective, that people who worked alongside her in that period described her in terms that were consistent across multiple accounts: patient, precise, calm under conditions that made other people panic, possessed of an accuracy at distance that they had never seen in anyone before or after. She named her daughter Lily. She kept her father's watch. She taught her to observe. She did not teach her to shoot for many years, not until Lily was old enough to ask, and to ask in the specific way that meant she already understood the weight of what she was asking. When she asked, Grace taught her everything. Not because Lily would need it, because knowledge that lives in one person dies with that person, because the most dangerous thing you can do with something you know is keep it only to yourself, because the summer at Aldridge's plantation had given Grace something that nobody intended to give her, and what nobody intends to give you is sometimes exactly what you need. She taught Lily the wind. She taught her the breathing. She taught her the patience, the specific practical patience of a person who understands that the right moment is not the available moment, that waiting for the right moment is not weakness, but precision. She taught her that the distance doesn't matter, that the distance is just a number, that what matters is how long you've been building the knowledge, and whether, when the moment comes, you are still enough to let the knowledge do what knowledge does when it has been properly prepared and properly held. Lily learned. The east window of what was once the Callaway main house is still there.
The building changed hands 3 times after old Calloway's death, and eventually converted to a different use and then abandoned, and now stands in various stages of structural dissolution in the heat and rain of Noxubee County, Mississippi. The window faces east. In the morning, light comes through it the same way it has always come through it, angled, specific. The particular quality of Mississippi morning light that has not changed because nothing that happened inside the building could change the angle of the sun. 8.5 football fields to the east, the tree line that Grace moved through on a Thursday morning in May of 1856 is still trees. Different trees. 68 years of growth and replacement have changed what stands there, but trees. The grass between is the same kind of grass, the same height, the same movement in a south wind. If you stood at the window and looked east at the right time of morning with good eyes, you might see the tree line moving in the wind. You might think about what good eyes are for. Grace knew what good eyes were for. She had known since she was 8 years old, watching a hawk from 200 yards while 2 men discussed her as if she weren't there. She saw things they didn't see. She always had. She always would. Thank you for being here at Lens of History. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what it means to see clearly in a world designed to make certain people invisible, hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment with one word, the word that describes Grace to you. Marksman, mother, patient. I want to know what you see when you look at this story. Because Grace always knew the distance is just a number. What matters is how long you've been building the knowledge. We'll see you next time.